Human error has been entirely removed from the skill of counter-strafing by the introduction of these two keyboards. At least that's what everyone is saying, but I'm not sure you should believe the hype. More than one pro has been using this setting for months, so I wanted to look at how much better those pros are actually playing, what perfect counter-strafing actually looks like, and how much of an advantage this keyboard will actually give you in real numbers. First, I want to talk about our sponsor, Leadify. Leadify helps you track your CS performance regardless of the version, except for CS 1.6 because that game sucks, hopefully making you a better player. With Leadify, you can track your true performance with their rating system that focuses on impact instead of kill to death ratio, and you can compare that with your friends whenever you have a good game so you can laugh at them. You can also track your bragging rights with their automatic highlights that somehow still make me look like a noob. Check out Leadify for free at the link in the description. A couple weeks ago, Razer released SnapTap and made the claim that they fixed CS2 movement with this update. Now what it does is automatically release your previous strafe key once you go to counter-strafe. So if you're running to the right and never let go of D, then tap A, you will instantly start to counter-strafe. The keyboard isn't doing the action for you, but it is removing a user's input based on assumed intent. Even the best players in the world don't have perfect counter-strafes, and in theory, this should make that possible. And this pretty immediately started a massive debate because, well, that feels like cheating. And if done with console commands, this is cheating. It would be called a null bind script, and it's well known in the movement community because it gives an advantage. But according to Faceit, and apparently TOs as well, it's not cheating if your keyboard does it. Which is why Wooting made this poll, saying this feature should be banned, but if it's not, do customers want them to add it? Obvious answer, yes. So they did. But I wanted to know, how much of an advantage does this actually give? Mouse is one of the first teams linked to SnapTap, and on the feature page, Zershin actually has a quote talking about it. Initially, it was rumored that Mouse used it during their ESL Pro League win, which is big if true, but apparently it's not. But because the CS community is amazing, someone posted on their Substack and showed which players used it when. Using Leadify, we can actually see how much of an impact this had on their counter-strafing. Before SnapTap, the average was 83%, and after SnapTap, it went all the way up to 82%. Wait. No, down to 82%. Look, there's more to it because the counter-strafe percent is just shots taken while still moving, and most of your shots are not right after a counter-strafe anyways. Now, when pros do counter-strafe, they're just going off of feel and muscle memory to know the timing, not actually waiting until they visibly stop, so it might take some time to actually notice this type of thing. A better question for pros is if their counter-strafes are faster now, but that data is pretty hard to get. But I can test myself and see how much overlap or missing input I have when I counter-strafe. And going frame by frame, sometimes I have one frame of overlap and sometimes none, so I'll estimate on average about 5 to 10 milliseconds. Then if I turn on SOCD, Wooting's version of SnapTap, I can see that on a perfect counter-strafe, I seem to get accurate somewhere from 1 to 5 milliseconds faster. If you've watched Optimum's video on this, where he estimates a 60 to 70 milliseconds advantage, you might already be commenting that I'm completely wrong. But please keep in mind, in his test, he has an unspecified amount of human error. Now, this overlap actually changed based on the keyboard I was using and how warmed up I was, but the thing about the overlap is that it isn't universal. Even adjusting for skill level, different players seem to have drastically different amounts of overlap, which helps explain why I felt almost nothing, and others say it's made a huge difference. While I sometimes have one frame of no input between counter-strafes, when I tested Austin, who's much better than me, he often had 2 or 3, which in theory could improve his time to accuracy by at least 10 or 20 milliseconds, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but it's actually a lot. On the other hand, this 10K rating player, despite being much worse than both of us, had little to no overlap at all. Now, on top of this, some players have a few frames of overlap, while others, like me, mostly have frames of no input, which means it'll take time for me to actually find any real benefit from switching to SnapTap. Now, as for the keyboard I was using, when using my normal Wooting keyboard with rapid trigger, which I'll explain in a bit, I'd find one frame of no input about half the time. But when I swapped to a normal mechanical keyboard, I did have a few minor errors. That's not to say my counter-strafing was perfect. There were a few shots I took while still moving, mostly right after getting tagged, but a couple of times I just held the counter-strafe down for too long, and with SnapTap, those things can still happen. In fact, the 10K rating player with near perfect counter-strafe in terms of overlap still had terrible actual counter-strafes because he held the opposite movement key for too long. If you look closely, he was still fully accurate, but he often moved slightly back after stopping or didn't come to a complete stop in the first place, which makes him likely to miss some shots without realizing it. Now, when I ask beginners about SnapTap, it seems like they think think it'll make a huge difference, which makes a lot of sense. The worse you are at counter-strafing, the more overlap you probably have. However, looking at specifics, it doesn't seem like the counter-strafing actually gets all that much better, because in theory, there are 3 ways to mess up a counter-strafe. You can hold the opposite key too long and start moving backwards, you can overlap both keys, the same as not counter-strafing, and you can start shooting before you actually stop. If overlapping is impossible, you still have to do the 2 others, and my impression is that those are harder to do than releasing your initial strafe key. But if you're a pro, even someone like Donk who says he didn't think this helped him that much, there is almost no reason not to use this. There's really no situations I can even think of where hitting both buttons at the same time is actually useful. But this still pales in comparison, in my opinion, to the impact I feel when adjusting actuation points on an analog keyboard or enabling rapid trigger. Originally, the reason analog keyboards became popular was actually because you can set a key to activate as soon as you begin to press it and deactivate the moment you begin to release, rather than waiting for the set actuation point you usually have on mechanical keyboards. So basically, if I'm counter-strafing, all I need to do is begin to release the original strafe key and it will instantly be fully released, which would explain the lack of actual overlap in my counter-strafes. In testing, Jojo, who was nice enough to accidentally close his stream and test this for me, felt the same way. Rapid trigger to him felt like a bigger deal than SOCD or snap tap. Unfortunately, with or without snap tap, these still feel a bit pay to win and do offer a slight advantage that isn't going anywhere. The difference is it's still your input controlling the play, even if the input is just beginning to release a key. Now, talking about snap tap specifically because it literally ignores an input, the standard argument I've seen in support of this is that it's similar to jump throw binds. One key doing multiple things to prevent human error. But to me, it feels like a lot more than that. Jump throws are more convenience and consistency than anything and could already be gained even without a single bind, while counter-strafing is one of the most core mechanics of the entire Counter-Strike series, so making that easier feels weird and I really don't like it, especially since I'm not sure it really makes the game that much easier for beginners. To me, the benefits of snap tap feel a bit overblown. I've seen people say, and I almost said myself, that this removes the human error entirely from counter-strafing, and from one aspect this is true, but I really don't think this is even the biggest issue people generally have when counter-strafing. When I watch beginner players, overlapping movement keys seems to be the smallest of their issues. But to be clear, that doesn't mean I think this should be legit. This still feels like cheating to me, and if it's against the rules to do with console commands, I don't know why it should be legal if your keyboard does it. Even if it's not the biggest advantage ever, it is literally ignoring an input to make the game easier. If I was guessing, after practice this might shave something like 5 to 20 milliseconds off of the average counter-strafe, which means if I was a pro, I would buy this in a second, but if you're not a pro, you should probably take Facet's advice and not buy a keyboard just for this feature, since they might change their minds. And in my opinion, they really should. At the end of this video, I should disclose that Wooting did send me a keyboard for free a couple of months ago, but it really didn't change anything about the way I made this, other than the fact that I didn't have to wait for one in the mail. Anyways, if you like this video, check out this other one YouTube thinks you'll enjoy.